Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we are talking all about alpha mats.
Yeah, they're really quite amazing.
They sound so technical though,
Yeah.
but from what I've seen from these YouTube videos you sent over, they are the key to so many awesome visual effects we see in movies and videos.
Right.
But before we get to all that cool stuff, can we start with the basics?
Sure.
Like, what exactly is an alpha mat? Let's pretend I'd never even heard of it before.
Okay, so think of it like a stencil. Like a stencil that you would use to paint a shape onto a surface. An alphamat is basically like a digital stencil for images and videos.
Okay, so instead of paint, we are controlling what parts of the image can be seen and how see-through they are.
Exactly. And the level of control you get is incredible. You can blend images together seamlessly, make things partially see-through. You can even make objects appear in front of or behind each other really convincingly.
Oh, wow. Okay, that makes sense. But I noticed in the videos that there's also something called a lumimat.
Yes.
How's that different?
So Lumamats are kind of like the simpler cousin of Alphamats. They also control transparency, but they use shades of gray instead of a dedicated transparency channel.
Oh, okay.
So imagine a black and white image. Black is totally transparent, white is totally opaque, and all the shades of gray in between create varying levels of transparency.
So it's kind of like using a grayscale image as a mask.
Exactly. And while they're not as precise as alphamats, they can be very useful for like basic effects. Like you could use a lumimat to add fog to a cityscape, making certain areas look hazy depending on the shades of gray.
Oh, like that one example where they made it look like those buildings were kind of fading into the fog?
Exactly.
Yeah, that was so cool.
Yeah, that's a great example of a lumimat. You'll often see them used for simple transitions or effects right on the edit page.
So basically, lumimats are good for the simpler stuff.
Right.
But when you need more control and precision, you go for the alpha mats.
Yeah, exactly. Alpha mats are kind of the heavy hitters when you're doing compositing, especially when you are dealing with visual effects. They just give you that granular level of control over transparency that you need to make the elements interact realistically.
Okay, so now I'm really curious to see how these alpha mats are used in practice.
Yeah.
The videos that you set, there were some pretty amazing examples.
There were.
Yeah.
One that really stood out to me was the example where they used an alpha mat to make it look like snow was falling only outside a cave.
Oh, wait, I remember that one.
Yeah.
It was a mountain scene, and the snow was falling everywhere except inside the cave opening.
Yeah.
It looks so real. How did they even do that?
So they basically used an alpha mat to isolate the area of the image where they wanted the snow to fall. So the alpha mat acted like a stencil, only allowing the snow to appear in the designated areas.
So it's like they masked out the cave so the snow wouldn't fall inside.
Exactly.
Oh, wow.
And that's just one example. They also used alpha mats to add dust and scratches to old jars to make them look super vintage.
Yeah, that one was really cool. They made those jars look like they were sitting in an attic for 100 years.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so now I'm starting to see the potential here, but I still don't quite get how this alpha mat thing actually works.
Okay.
Like, how does an image have this extra information about transparency?
That's a great question. It's all about that dedicated transparency channel we talked about. So think of it like having a separate black and white image that corresponds to your main image. In this black and white image, black areas represent complete transparency, white areas are fully opaque, and the shades of gray in between create those varying levels of transparency.
So it's like a hidden set of instructions for transparency that's attached to the image.
You got it. And that set of instructions, that's the alphamat, is what allows editors to combine multiple images or video clips seamlessly, making it look like those elements are truly interacting with each other.
Wow. It's like a secret code that just unlocks all these amazing possibilities.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I'm assuming different software handles these alpha mats in different ways.
Yeah, you're right. The software that they used in these videos, DaVinci Resolve, is actually really versatile.
Okay.
It can use alphamats in a couple of different ways.
Oh, how so?
Well, you can actually use alphamats on the edit page for simpler compositing tasks. Like, let's say you wanted to layer a title over a video with some transparency.
So for stuff that doesn't need super precise control, you can just work with the alpha mats right there on the edit page.
Exactly.
Okay.
But if you need more advanced control, you can also use alphamats in the color page or even in Fusion.
Wait, Fusion?
Yeah.
What's that?
Fusion is DaVinci Resolve's built-in compositing software.
Hold on. So DaVinci Resolve has its own compositing software. That's awesome.
It does. And in Fusion, you have all these powerful tools for creating, refining, and manipulating alphamats to achieve some really complex visual effects.
So it's like going from using a simple paintbrush to having an entire artist's studio.
Exactly.
Wow. And that's where things get really interesting because there are actually so many ways to create these alpha mats.
Right.
Yeah. So tell me, what are some of the ways these magical mats are made?
Well, one of the most common methods is what's called keying. It's like when you use a green screen and the software automatically removes the green to isolate the subject.
Right.
That process of removing the green is essentially creating an alpha mat.
So anything that was green becomes transparent, and anything that wasn't green becomes opaque.
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
And that creates a clean separation between your subject and the background, which allows you to then replace the background with whatever you want.
So that's how they do those shots where it looks like people are like flying through space or standing on alien planets.
Precisely.
Cool.
But keying isn't the only way to create alpha mats.
What else is there?
There's something called rotoscoping, where artists literally trace the outline of an object frame by frame to create a really precise mat.
Oh, wow. That sounds super meticulous.
It definitely requires a skilled hand and a lot of patience.
Yeah.
It's often used for more complex shapes or when you can't use a green screen.
So it's like they are basically drawing a mask by hand for each frame of the video.
That's a great way to put it. And then there's another way that is a lot less labor intensive, especially if you are working with 3D elements.
Oh, tell me about this easier method.
Well, when you create 3D models and animations, the software can often generate alpha mats right alongside the rendered image.
Okay.
So you get the 3D object A&D, its corresponding alpha mat, ready to be composited into a scene.
Oh, that's super convenient. So
Yeah.
if you're working with 3D, you're basically already set up with the alpha mats that you need.
Exactly. It really streamlines the workflow for compositing 3D elements into live action footage.
This is all so cool. I'm starting to see now how alpha mats are like, they're the foundation for so many visual effects.
They really are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even though we just scratched the surface here, I'm already starting to kind of grasp the core concepts.
That's great.
I feel like I'm just at the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to explore.
There is.
But before we get ahead of ourselves, I think it's important to acknowledge that working with alpha mats is not always easy. There are some common challenges that you might run into.
Yeah.
What kinds of challenges?
Well, one that often trips people up is this concept of pre-multiplied versus unpre-multiplied alpha.
Oh, okay, that sounds a bit intimidating. What does that even mean?
Don't worry. It's not as complicated as it sounds. It basically has to do with how the color information in your image is handled in relation to the transparency. And it's important to understand the difference because it can actually affect how your color corrections are applied.
So it's like a setting that can mess with your colors if you're not careful.
You could say that. But don't worry, we will dive deeper into all of that in the next part of our deep dive.
Oh, good.
Yeah, we'll break it down. We'll give you some tips on how to avoid any color-related disasters.
Phew. Okay, good. Because
Yeah.
I'm definitely not ready to ruin all of my cool compositing work with like wonky colors.
Right.
So what other challenges are there?
Another common one is dealing with what's called edge artifacts. These are like little imperfections that can sometimes appear around the edges of your keyed or masked object.
Oh, like little glitches or halos.
Exactly.
Oh.
They can be really distracting and make your composite look less realistic. But luckily, there are techniques and tools to help you fix those. And that's another thing we can cover in the next part of our deep dive.
Perfect. So it's like alpha mats are this powerful tool, but there are some nuances and potential pitfalls to watch out for.
Exactly.
Okay.
But with a little bit of knowledge and practice, you can overcome those challenges and really harness the power of alpha mats to create some really, truly stunning visual effects.
I'm ready to take on those challenges.
Yeah.
This is all so much cooler than I ever imagined.
I'm glad you're excited. We'll continue our exploration in the next part of our deep dive.
Awesome.
We'll delve deeper into those challenges and some of the techniques for refining your alpha mats.
Fantastic. I can't wait to uncover more of the secrets behind these magical mats.
Yeah.
So for our listener, if you're just joining us, we are taking a quick break. But don't go anywhere, because when we come back, we'll be diving even deeper into the world of alpha mats, tackling those challenges and revealing some pro tips to help you master this really amazing technique. Welcome back. I am ready to tackle those alpha mat challenges, the ones that we touched on before.
Yeah.
Especially that whole pre-multiplied versus unpre-multiplied alpha. It still sounds a bit like a secret code to me.
It might sound like a secret code, but it's a pretty important concept to grasp if you really want to work with alpha mats effectively. Remember those color correction issues?
Oh, right, yeah. You were saying something about how pre-multiplied alpha can potentially mess with the colors.
Exactly. The VFX study video actually does a fantastic job of explaining this. They use this example of a blue sphere, and they show how pre-multiplied alpha essentially bakes in the transparency with the color information.
So if you have a blue sphere that's like 50% transparent, the blue color itself is also 50% dimmer.
Precisely. And while this can be really useful for certain workflows, especially if you're working with, elements that were created with pre-multiplied alpha in mind, it can sometimes lead to unexpected results when you try to color correct your image.
So if I try to brighten up that semi-transparent blue sphere, I'm not just brightening the blue, but I'm also brightening the transparency.
Exactly.
That sounds like it could create some weird halos and fringing.
Exactly. And that's where unpremultiplied alpha comes in. Instead of premixing the color and transparency, it keeps them separate.
So it's like the color of the blue sphere is stored as if it were fully opaque, and the alpha channel handles the transparency kind of independently.
You got it. This means you have much more flexibility when it comes to color correction because you're only affecting the color and not the transparency.
Okay, so unpremultiplied alpha sounds like the way to go if you want more control.
Yeah.
But can you mix and match? Like, what if you have one image that's pre-multiplied alpha and another one that's unpremultiplied?
That's where things can get a little tricky. It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. You really want to make sure that all of your elements are using the same type of alpha to avoid those unexpected results.
So knowing your alpha type is crucial for avoiding those weird color shifts and artifacts in your composites.
Right.
It's like making sure that everyone's speaking the same language.
That's a great analogy. Now, let's move on to another challenge that can be a real headache when you're doing compositing those edge artifacts.
Oh, yes, those halos and fringes. They can really make a composite look not so great. The videos had some tips on how to deal with those, right?
Yeah, they did. One technique that's often used is called edge blurring. It's kind of like feathering the edges of a selection in Photoshop. By softening the edges of your matte, you can help blend it more seamlessly with the background.
So it's less about, like a hard edge and more about making a smooth transition.
Exactly. And there are actually various ways to achieve this. Some compositing software have built-in tools for edge blurring. In Fusion, for example, you can use the matte control node to adjust the edge blur.
Oh, that's right. I remember seeing that pre-divide, post-multiply checkbox in DaVinci Resolve's color page.
Right.
Does that have anything to do with edge artifact?
It absolutely does. That checkbox is a handy shortcut for handling the alpha division and multiplication behind the scenes, which can really help create a cleaner composite and reduce those artifacts.
So it's kind of like DaVinci Resolve is doing some behind-the-scenes magic to smooth things out for us.
You could say that. It's a great option if you're not working in a dedicated compositing software like Fusion. But speaking of Fusion, did you notice how they used it to really refine those alpha mattes?
Yeah. They were using something called a matte control node, and they were talking about spill suppression.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to admit, I got a little bit lost in the technical details there.
It can get a bit technical, but the basic idea is that Fusion gives you a lot more control over your mattes. The matte control node, as we said, can be used for edge blurring, but it also has this really cool feature called spill suppression.
Spill suppression. Okay, now you're really talking in code words.
Imagine you're filming someone in front of a green screen, and they're wearing like a white shirt. Sometimes the green light from the screen can actually reflect onto their shirt and give it a slight green tinge. That's spill.
Ah, so it's like the green is bleeding onto the subject.
Precisely. And spill suppression tools, like the ones in Fusion, can really help to neutralize that unwanted color, creating a cleaner key and a more realistic composite.
So it's like having a digital cleanup crew that comes in and gets rid of any unwanted color contamination.
That's a great way to think about it. It's another example of how the right tools can really make a difference when you're working with alpha mattes.
It's like having a whole arsenal of options for tackling those little imperfections and making your composites look as polished as possible.
Absolutely. But before you get too excited about showing off all your perfectly composited masterpieces to the world, there's one more hurdle we need to talk about. Exporting your videos with alpha channels.
Oh, right. You mentioned that earlier. You said it can be tricky to export alpha channels correctly.
It can be, especially if you're not aware of the right settings and workflows. You see, if you want to use your composited footage in other editing software, you need to make sure that alpha channel is preserved.
So that all that transparency information that you worked so hard to create doesn't just get lost.
Exactly. It's like sending a letter without an address.
Right.
It won't reach its destination. So what are some key things to keep in mind when exporting with alpha channels?
Well, one of the most important things is choosing the right codec and file format.
Okay.
The videos recommended a codec called Cineform RGB 16-bit. It's known for handling alpha channels really well.
And what about exporting like individual clips? Is that something that you should think about?
Absolutely. If you're working with multiple layers or elements and they each have their own alpha channels, exporting them individually can really ensure that each element retains its transparency information.
So it's like giving each element its own little travel visa so it can move freely between editing programs.
I love that analogy. But
Yeah.
even with those tips, the videos kind of made it clear that exporting alpha channels from Fusion in particular can be kind of a headache.
Yeah.
There were some specific steps, some workarounds that they mentioned that seemed a bit involved.
Yeah, they talked about creating a separate alpha output in Fusion and then bringing it into DaVinci Resolve's color page and routing it through a bunch of nodes. It was like a whole complex dance routine.
It was, and even then, it wasn't always guaranteed to work perfectly.
Yeah, hopefully they'll streamline that whole process in future updates. Yeah, fingers crossed.
I guess the takeaway here is that exporting with alpha channels can be tricky, but it's really important if you want to use your composited footage in other software. Choosing the right settings, thinking about maybe exporting individual elements for, maximum flexibility, it's definitely key.
Absolutely. It's worth taking the time to really understand those export settings and making sure that you're preserving those alpha channels correctly, because it truly bridges your compositing work to the larger world of video editing.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here in part 2 of our deep dive. We tackled those pre-multiplied and unpre-multiplied alpha settings, we explored some techniques for fixing those edge artifacts, and we even ventured into the wild world of exporting with alpha channels.
It's been quite a journey, and we're really starting to unravel some of the more nuanced aspects of working with alpha mats.
I'm feeling a lot more confident about using alpha mats now, but I'm also realizing that there's always more to learn.
There is.
But that's what makes this all so exciting. Now, in part 3, I think it's time we step back and look at the bigger picture.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's shift gears and talk about how alpha mats are actually used in visual storytelling and what all of this means for someone who's just starting out. Someone who's just starting to explore their creative potential with this technique.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Welcome back to the deep dive.
Yeah.
We've been really digging into the technical side of alpha mats, but now I'm really excited to talk about what it all means for visual storytelling.
Me too. I think it's really easy to kind of get lost in all the technical stuff and forget that alpha mats are really just a tool for creative expression.
Totally. It's like learning how to use a paintbrush.
Right.
But then forgetting that the real magic happens when you actually start to paint a picture.
Yeah. That's a great analogy. And when it comes to visual storytelling, alpha mats are like having this whole set of special brushes that allow you to like create these illusions, blend realities, and basically transport your audience to these other worlds.
One thing that it blew my mind when I was watching those YouTube videos was how seamlessly alpha mats can blend the real and the unreal.
Yeah.
Like in that example where they made the UFO appear behind the guy walking in the park, it looked so convincing.
It's amazing, right? That's the power of alpha mats. They can create these moments of visual wonder that just suspend disbelief and draw the viewer right into the story.
It's like creating a world where anything is possible.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why alpha mats are so essential in filmmaking, especially when you're talking about genres like science fiction and fantasy.
Absolutely. Think about all of those epic space battles and magical realms that you see in the movies.
Right.
So many of those effects rely on alpha mats to, composite all those different elements together seamlessly.
It's like alpha mats are that secret ingredient that makes all the movie magic happen.
Yeah.
But it's not just about creating those big, spectacular effects.
Yeah.
I noticed that the videos also showed how alpha mats could be used in, more subtle ways.
Yeah.
To enhance the realism or the emotional impact of a scene.
Yeah, that's a great observation.
Yeah.
Remember that example with the cityscape and the fog? It wasn't this really flashy effect or anything,
Right.
but it added so much atmosphere and mood to that whole scene.
And that snow falling outside the cave, but not inside.
Yeah.
It created that sense of isolation and contrast that really added to the story.
Exactly. So while alpha mats can certainly be used to create those wow moments,
Right.
they can also be used in much more subtle ways to really enhance the overall visual language and storytelling of your content.
It's like you're adding this extra layer of depth and meaning to your visuals. It creates this richer, more engaging experience for the viewer.
Mm.
I'm really starting to see how mastering this technique can really take someone's filmmaking to the next level. Really elevate their video editing skills.
Absolutely. And as you become more comfortable with alpha mats, you'll start to see those creative opportunities everywhere. You'll be able to kind of envision how you could use this technique to tell your own stories, create unique visual styles, and really make your content stand out.
It's like unlocking this whole other level of creative potential. I bet it's a really rewarding feeling to see your ideas come to life on the screen, knowing you have this powerful tool in your toolbox.
It's incredibly rewarding. And as technology continues to evolve, the possibilities for using alpha mats will only continue to expand.
Oh, that's so exciting. So for our listener who's been with us on this deep dive, exploring the world of alpha mats, what's the key takeaway? What do you want to leave them with?
I would say just don't be afraid to experiment. Play around with these techniques, push those boundaries and see where your creativity takes you. Because with the power of alpha mats, there's really no limit to the stories that you can tell.
That's a great message. It's all
Yeah.
about, embracing the creative possibilities and just having fun with it.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe someday you'll be the one creating those really mind-blowing visual effects that just leave the audience in awe.
Well, it's been an awesome deep dive, and we hope you've gained a newfound appreciation for the magic and versatility of alpha mats.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep creating, and keep diving deep.
See ya.